Good afternoon. My name is Stanley Kober, and I'd like to welcome you to our discussion today. Our speaker is Dr. Radvan Ziadeh. He is the founding director of the Damascus Center for Human Rights Studies and the executive director of the Syrian Center for Political and Strategic Studies. He was most recently a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University and a 2008-2009 visiting scholar at Harvard University's Center for Human Rights. A leading authority on human rights and political reform in the Middle East, Dr. Ziadeh was named the best political science researcher in the Arab world by Jordan's Abdul Hamid Shoman Foundation in 2004. He is the author of numerous publications, including most recently Power and Policy in Syria, Intelligence Services, Foreign Relations, and Democracy in the Modern Middle East, which is forthcoming next year in 2010. Dr. Ziadeh is currently a Reagan Fassel Democracy Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. Welcome, Dr. Ziadeh, and please begin. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the Rumi Forum for this invitation. And actually, my presentation will be very focused on what's called the political division and democratization in Middle East. It's we know in the political theory that the elections, with the most components of the democracy, will be lead to the democracy, and democracy for the long run will lead to the stability. But why this is not the case in the Middle East? We'll focus primarily on the three countries, especially Lebanon and Palestine and Iraq. Those three countries has such kind of free and fair elections in 2004, 2005, then Lebanon in 2009. We expected that to have election in Iraq in 2010. And those three countries which has such kind of elections, that the results of the election didn't lead to the democracy or functioning democracy, or at least to stability, but it leads to such kind of political division and the struggle between political parties. What's the explanation for that? If we talk if we have the broader vision to the whole Middle East, we can divide it, I think, to two categories. The first category, we'll see Iraq, the occupied Palestinian territories, and Sudan, Yemen, and it's Lebanon. Those five countries, they have active civil war in a way or not. The other countries, which include Egypt, Algeria, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain, they have what I describe them latent civil war. I mean that at any time when something will change in these five countries, they will have the sectarian division, then we'll have the struggle between the political parties. Why that's happened in the Middle East? This is what I'm trying to explain during my presentation. Everyone knows that the struggle in Iraq, which we're focusing on, as I said, these three countries, in Iraq between the Shia and Sunni militias and the central government. With the same thing in Lebanon, which the struggle between the two movements, one calls it 14 March, and the second called 8 March. The 14 March is coalition between the Sunni and the Christian political parties, and the majority of the 8 March, it's of course the coalition between the Shia, especially Hezbollah and Amal, and some people from the General Michel Aoun, some Maroon Christian. The same thing in Palestine. We have at least two governments, one in Gaza run by Hamas and the other in Ramallah. this divided Middle East, this is the new Middle East as Condoleezza, former Secretary Condoleezza Rice described in after the war between Hezbollah and Israel in 2006, when she announced the birth of the new Middle East. I mean that this is something we have to look at. Of course, I think I can expand also my argument, as I said, that to other countries, especially Sudan and Yemen, because now we have active going on civil war in Yemen between Saada, between the Houthi, which with the Houthi, majority of them are Shia, and the central government in Sana'a. With the same thing in Sudan. Sudan has trouble in the southern of Sudan and in the Darfur. Actually, the deep divisions between the ethnic and the religious and the sectarian identities, these forces coexisted with each other throughout much of the history in the Middle East, especially in all these countries. They now mark and they're looking for their identity, which described not as a national identity, but as sectarian or as ethnic identity. The strange paradox of Sudan, Yemen, and Lebanon is that the need for democracy is supposed to raise a higher than degrees of division and unity. Democracy is believed to be able to moderate the positions of the involved parties, supporting them to redraft both evaluations and calculations, ultimately leading them to compromise. However, the exact opposite happened in these three countries. If we look to the outcomes of the elections in Iraq in 2004 and the Palestinian Authority in 2005 and Lebanon in 2005 and 2009, within each of these cases, radical Islamist movements and parties quickly rose to the socio-political service. This movement opposed the US policies and corruption within their own secular Arab establishment. They attended political prominence in the run-up to the elections. The elections themselves exhibited an atmosphere of considerable integrity. And of course, for many observers, especially international observers who attend the Palestinian elections, former President Carter was there, and for the Lebanese election, for the international observer, they describe the elections as free and fair elections. Elements of political society in the Middle East must recognize the merits of both existing and potential structural arrangement. Such arrangements have often yielded repeated conflicts, civil wars, and struggle of sectarianism. This had locked the political system into competition over with faction monopolizes social and rescue sectors. What's the impact of these three elections on the US policy? Because that's important, because before 2004 and 2005 and the failure of the mass destruction in Iraq, that the Bush administration put on the promotion democracy in Middle East on agenda, and pushed for democracy in all the Arab world, especially in Egypt and in Palestine and in Iraq and Lebanon. But when the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt won in the election, which get 88 seats, and the Hamas won in the Palestinian elections, the U.S. administration backed from its policy to push for democracy in Middle East. That's one of the implementation that, and we heard about the discussion here about the realism and Wilsonism. That even that it's the democracy, it's our values, but we have to put our interests before our values. And this is such kind of discussion in the U.S. which reflected on the U.S. foreign policy to Middle East. Then the Bush administration back to the same establishment which was looking for to the oil and stability and security, and don't move or pushed for democracy promotion in the Middle East. But now, if we back to the why that's happened in these three countries, I mean that there is some arguments by some Arab scholars and for some U.S. experts that the main reason is the occupation in Iraq and the Palestine. But I describe that as one of the factor, but not only the legitimate argument. Because usually that when you have occupation, that as a reaction, most of the political parties that help them to be more united. And this is not the case in Iraq and Palestine. With the same also that we know as Yemen. Yemen, it's among three countries over the world which they never colonized in the contemporary history. But even that Yemen, which I think, especially in the northern Yemen, they have the same experience with other Arab countries which has occupation. I mean that the occupation is not the reason at all. Some of the scholars also, they argue that because of the Arabic or the Islamic culture, and they use the term of the Arab exhibitionism. I don't believe in the culture factor at all, and I don't belong to this school, and my argument is that if we go to Japan as example, that Japan, which has a long history in violence in foreign policy and on its neighbor, especially in Korea, in Russia, in China, and in Philippines. But now Japan, it shift its foreign policy, and nobody now talking about that's because the cultural reason. The same thing for the Scandinavian countries. Nobody raises the issue that the Denmark or Finland, it's the sons or the generation of the Viking. Because I mean that the culture, it can be changed. But the culture, we have to understand that the culture is something changeable, and the culture is something as the conclusion for the political and the social change. Then what's the reasons for such kind of political division in Middle East? I have, I think, 4 or 5 reasons. The first one, what's called the failure of the modern Arab state. We know that the age of the modern Arab state is very short comparing to other parts of the world. I mean the most or the oldest modern Arab state, which Egypt, it go back only to more than 70 or 80 years. But if we compare that to Japan, which exists as a central state from 1818, with the same thing like go to Latin America, Brazil exists as a central state from 1998. Well, this is not the case in the Arab world, which most of the Arab countries, they get independence very soon comparing to other countries. I mean that Algeria is get independence in 1964, Kuwait 1968, Syria 1948. It's I mean the age of the modern Arab state still very new to allow for such kind of political institution to exist very strongly comparing to other parts of the world. And the second And the second reason, what's called the Fourth Modernity. I mean that most of the Arabic countries, they have the political institutions like the parliament, the political parties, but for the people there is no meanings for such kind of institutions. I mean, even that all of the Arab countries, they have a parliament, but most of the people, they know that the parliament hasn't any power, or are doing nothing in the decision-making process. I mean, there is no authority for the parliament or the people's council. Then the same thing for the political parties. We know that the political parties, the same thing for the Constitution. We know that in the U.S., the history of the U.S. Constitution, it's like the core of the democracy in U.S. But this is not the case in the Arab countries. Most of the Arab countries, they change the Constitution. In Egypt, they have 4 constitutions in the contemporary history in 50 years. In Syria, we have 9 constitutions. They changed in 60 years. I mean, that didn't allow for such kind of constitutional culture to be exist, and then the people to defend on the constitutions as something as the common value for the people. Third reason, that the external factor, which I think it's very important, and because in these 3 countries, Iraq and Lebanon and Palestine, every side they use the external factor to challenge or to struggle with the other side, with other part in the country. I mean, Iran backed Hezbollah and March 8 movement, and U.S. backed March 14. Then that of course deepened the struggle between the 2 parts. And the last reason, I think, that the role of the armed non-state actors, especially Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine, and the same the militias in Iraq, which played very important role in not to have functioning democracy, because if you allowed for the non-state actors to have weapons, to have arm in their hands, in far of the central government, of course that creates fear inside the society, especially if the non-state actors is described as the ethnic group or as the religious group. It will be more dangerous for the democracy and for the other parts of the world. And and thank you very much for your listening.
Well, thank you for those remarks. I'll take the moderator's privilege of asking the first question while people in the audience prepare their questions. You mentioned elections and part of democracy, and that has certainly been the American focus. My background is primarily in Soviet Russian studies. When the Cold War was ending, I was struck to see in the Soviet literature a increasing emphasis on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And they would say that Gorbachev's policy of perestroika was based on the philosophy of Kant. And in particular, they mentioned the rule of law state. And in Russian, the law here can be defined in 2 ways. What they refer to was in Russian the pravovaya государство, which is a rights-based law from human rights, prava человека, as opposed to what might be called законные государства, which is just laws as rules. So законные would be rules. That doesn't translate well into English. We think of rule of law, we don't make this distinction. But I was struck that they talked about the rule of law state based on the philosophy of Kant, and it was a rights-based rule of law. And I'm wondering if that's something we missed when we kept talking about democracy and election. Did we not put enough emphasis on the importance of the rule of law?
Yeah, I think this is very important question. Frank Fukuyama has a new book on that, the role of law, especially in over the world, and he made some comparison between the Middle East, especially the Arab world, and Russia and Europe and US. He said that his argument that there is a demand for the role of law in the Arab region, but when the the Arab region itself, they have traditional role, especially because they that's coming from the Sharia, from Islam. But when the new modern state established in the Arab world, they didn't allow for the traditional laws to continue. I mean, they destroyed the traditional law, and they didn't establish a new system of laws, or as the Western laws or something like that. Then the Arab world became as a mess, because what we have in the Arab world, that you have such kind of dictatorships, which most of them, they don't believe in the role of law. I made a study as a comparison between the Czechoslovakia, Polonia, and Romania, and especially in the Eastern Europe, and it's a transition into democracy. Is there some lessons we can learn in the Middle East, especially both regions? They depends on the Soviet Union. I found that there is much more differences than the similarities. The first reason, that most of the communist parties in the Eastern Europe, they depend primarily on the Soviet Union. When the Communist Party in the Soviet Union collapsed, there is no reason, or there is no argument for the Communist parties in Romania or in Eastern Europe to still in power. Then they lose their argument, then the change will become. But this is not not the case in the Middle East. I mean, even that Iraq, Syria, and Algeria, they depend on the Soviet Union, but still have such kind of distance. They distinguish themselves and they use the national feeling to play as a role, that we are not only communist parties, but only we are Arabism, or as they use the national feeling, which allowed for them to still to use the same argument. The second reason, that even that you have communist parties in Czech Republic, Romania, and others, but it's such kind of, even that we cannot describe it as political party. It depends from grassroots, then they have election to high level, because all the decisions they've been taken by the leadership board or the leadership council in the communist parties. But if anyone from the leadership council will resign or will retire, then we'll go home. This is not the case of the Middle East. What we have in Middle East, we have family regimes. I mean, this is when you see that Bashar al-Assad can inherit his father. The same thing that will happen in Egypt, in Libya, in Yemen. That's allowed for the new sons to inherit their fathers in the state, which I think that we have some examples in Turkmenistan or in some African countries, which what's the reason to allow for such kind of for political parties or for the ruler parties in the Arab world to allow for their sons to inherit them in their positions? I think that's because the lack of the rule of law, the lack of the in the constitution, and which most important, that there is no civil society or a very strong opposition can play very important role. Not this to happen in Syria or in Egypt or in other countries.
Thank you. We have our first question here. If you could identify yourself and wait for the microphone. The microphone is right behind you. There you
So it's on, is it?
Yeah.
My name is Ranjit Chatterjee. I am affiliated with the University of Maryland, and I am a very happy visitor to the Rumi Forum on several occasions. Thank you, Professor Ziadeh, for your wonderful presentation, very lucid. I would like to move, I have questions for you, but I would like to move somewhat something the moderator raised about the difference between different translations for law in Slavic languages. I can contribute that the word zakon, which is pan-Slavic, in Czech, for example, I studied a bit of Bohemian in my long and checkered past, is translated as covenant or testament. We have Nový zákon and Starý zákon, as even a Russianist would understand. So perhaps that is helpful in that respect. Going back to the speaker, please. I found your presentation formally very lucid and compact and helpful, of course. But I had a couple of questions. For example, these armed groups like Hamas and many others in the Arab world that arise, and which you said was frightening to the people. Who do they represent? How do they arise? And what cultural or any other ethnic forces do they represent in common in theoretical terms? So that's one question. The other is about your comments on Polonia, Romania, and Czechia, minus the Slovakia now. There I would say that the cultures, especially Poland and Czechoslovakia, that I know a bit more of than Romania, which the Czechs and Poles regard as a gypsy country. You know, it's an insult to be Romanian. It means you're a Romanian gypsy. From what I recall in bar rooms in Prague, if I may refer to that aspect of my experience. But in Poland and Czechoslovakia, there is a strong cultural element, literary element, knowledge of the past, of the behavior of big powers, of the absurdity of, totalitarian regimes. Just one novel in Czechoslovakia will illustrate that. It's called The Good Soldier Švejk by Jaroslav Hašek, which I would recommend to political scientists with an interest in literature, such as yourself. So I will seize my rambling remarks with that one. Thank you.
It's thank you very much. I think that even that the Arab culture and the Islamic culture, it has its tradition. Some of Islamic experts, they use the term the opposition. In the Islamic history, there is such kind of the tradition of the term of the opposition. But unfortunately, that's in the Islamic tradition, there is a lot of writings on the behaviors, on the prayers, on other issues. But because there is no tradition for the central government or for such kind of, then you have lack of writings. I mean, that's when the Islamic State, they emerged, they took the Romanian Empire as a model. The Umayyad and the Abbasi, they used the Romanian state as a model, and of course they used some Persian literature, which it's called in Arabic al-adab al-sultaniya. I mean, such kind of literatures which allowed for the sultan or for the caliphate to be the ruler and to be king, but not have the same name, which allowed him as absolute power for the sultan and for the sultan in the Islamic Khilafah. But with the same time, which back to the Islamic tradition for the Sharia law, you will find that there is a tradition of the judiciary system. I mean that at that time that you have a strong judiciary system, independent judiciary system, which you don't have in other civilizations, especially in the medieval centuries. The judge at that time, he can bring the Khalifa or the king, which equal the king in other civilization, can bring the Khalifa with ordinary people, as when the ordinary people accuse the Khalifa in many things. But why the independence of the judiciary system didn't develop or has any progress in the Islamic? Because the lack of the institutions. I mean that the idea of the institutions came to the Islamic world or the Arabic world from the Western tradition, not developed as the Islamic or the Arabic civilization as institutions. Which I mean that now still have the Arab world still struggle between how to have moderate political institutions, and especially when they depend on the legal terms, and
Okay. I will take any corrections to my Russian, which is not what it used to be. But the principal point I was making, which here, the idea of a rights-based law, the Prabhupada suggests, when the Cold War was ending, I was struck by Soviet commentaries that they were wrong to oppose the idea that interference on human rights was interference in a country's internal affairs. They said no country should be allowed to get away with violations of fundamental human rights. This was, to my mind, an extraordinary breakthrough. I fear we have lost that moment. They, at that point, were very big on the OSCE. And I've sometimes wondered, in terms of the situation in the Middle East with Syria and other countries, whether it might have been a good idea to have an OSCE similar to that in that part of the world. Could it have had the transforming effect that the OSCE, to our amazement, played in the end of the Cold War? You really have to go back and read the Soviet commentaries from the late 1980s. I was amazed. So enough for me. Any other questions here? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ziadeh. My name is Muhammad Abdullah. I'm Syrian human rights activist. We're talking about the political divided in the countries. I see the most politically divided countries is the most democracy countries in the area. So if you have a quick look at the Freedom House and Reporters Sans Frontiers reports, you see the freedom of press and freedom of expression is the most highest in Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine. So my idea is these countries, the politically divided countries, they didn't achieve democracy because of political divides, or they achieved that democracy because of this political divide. And the second question is the use of the United States of the democracy idea after the failed of the weapons of mass destruction. That hurt the democracy itself. Like United States didn't push for democracy in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and that's why what they did in Libya, like they don't look to that criminal called Muammar Gaddafi now. That hurt the idea of democracy itself, and that led for more political division in there. Thank you.
Let's begin from the questions and go back to have some comparison between the Eastern Europe and Middle East. When the Reagan administration pushed for democracy in the Eastern Europe, not because the democracy itself, but because they need to have some struggle with the Soviet Union. And they used the term of the democracy and human rights, which of course that's helpful for the democratic movements in Solidarity in Poland and Civic Forum and 77 Charter in Czechoslovakia and in other countries, which I think that can have the same. I mean that, of course, the Bush administration, they misused the term of democracy in Middle East because there is no infrastructure, there is no mass weapons destruction in Iraq. Then they pick up the word of democracy because there is lack of democracy. I mean that the democracy is never implemented in any of the US or the EU policies as a value in itself. It became as second or third priority in the foreign policy. But even that, it's important for the Middle East to have, for the U.S. or for the U.S. to focus more in the democracy, because we are suffered for more than 60 years toward the U.S. foreign policy toward Middle East, focusing primarily on the oil and security and the stability, with stability that's mean support such kind of dictatorships or dictators in the Arab world. Now, if we shift to the other term, even that's for primarily reasons or for primary interest, but that's of course will have impact in the Middle East. For first question, I do believe that what we missed in the Middle East, we don't have the model. In Latin America, Brazil and Argentina had the model, then the other small countries, they follow up the big countries. With the same thing in Eastern Europe. I mean that Poland and Czechoslovakia, they lead the region to the democracy. But what we have in the Arab world, that the influential countries, especially Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, all of these countries, they are suffering in their domestic issues. And Syria, of course, it's became as one of the worst of the wars, as Freedom House, compared to democracy or human rights. With the same thing in Egypt, President Hosni Mubarak now is 28 years in his office, but there is nothing as you can see that next time you resign or something like that. I mean that what we have the lack of the model in Middle East, which I believe it's very important. We'll see that Dubai in the Gulf countries, if you travel in if you have traveled in the Gulf countries in the 60s or 70s, you will see nothing. You will see the sounds, the mountains. But now Dubai have the leading model for all of the Gulf countries to follow up. Before that, the princes or the kings, they used to spend the money for nothing. They spend the money, they put the money in Switzerland or in other banks, in the Western banks. But now, Dubai, they create the model for the Gulf countries. And it did. Yesterday I heard that Qatar, even Qatar, very small countries, they have very ambitious plan to have real estate network, real network, and they have metro subway network for more than $25 billion. Even that's in Qatar, everyone has a car. Why they do that? I mean, that's even such kind of infrastructure, it's important, which I believe that the infrastructure or the economic growth, that will reflect or of the mind of the people, then they thinking in the next time of the political reform, which I think that's now why Qatar is because Qatar is full of Dubai, the same thing for Al Sharqa and for Oman, for Kuwait, all of these Gulf countries, they follow the Dubai model. Now we need at least the Arabic model who has the leading power in the road of democracy in the Middle East.
Yes, ma'am.
Do we need a mic?
Yeah. Can you turn it on?
There we go. Okay. I'm Cynthia Butler, I'm an attorney actually, so I appreciated the understanding of the rule of law in those dimensions. My question is you've avoided mentioning the word secularization, and in this country, we have this pushback when there is too much encroachment or interference of the state, of any religious authority on the state, and we have, a whole body of law that we developed with provide the separation, the constitutional separation of the First Amendment, et cetera. In various Arab countries, do you believe that impulses towards secularization increase or are indifferent to the impulses for democratization? I mean, we look at things like what happened in Iran elections, and we see the clerics controlling the whole political infrastructure. And so I guess Sharia law plays a different role in understanding in the mindset of a lot of these Muslim majority countries than, say, Christianity or Catholicism does in Eastern Bloc countries, right? So what would be your take on the ideal Arab model in terms of the impulses or innovations of secularization model, secularization, I don't know how to express it, I think you sort of get my drift, but is there a way to separate, without a formal constitutional separation of church and state such as we have here, the influences of any one clerical body, or is that even advisable in your view?
First of all, don't forget that there is different versions of secularizations. The secular state in France is very different than the U.S.
Or Italy.
or Italy or
Okay.
Germany. I mean that, of course, the much more far secular, it's the French one, the French model, which is called the Jacobian model in 1905, which I think that, unfortunately, most of the Arab intellectuals look for the French model. They don't look to the United States model, which I believe is the best one for the separation between the church and the state. Why because most of the Arab elites in the 50s and 60s, they graduate from France and from the French universities, and they grow up in France. Don't forget that the Arabism and the Arab nationalism, it's a transfer from the theories from French and German thinkers in the 50s and 60s. That, of course, reflect on the Arab understanding of the nationalism. But the U.S. model, which has actually the great example of the tolerance which allowed all for the religion to coexist with each other without any problems. Then the state itself hasn't any influence by any of these religions. I have a new friend, my colleague in National Endowment of Democracy from Iraq, which is a newcomer to United States, and the first Jum'ah, you know the Jum'ah, there is prayer in Islam. The first Jum'ah, I took him to the church to pray Jum'ah there, and he surprised that can we pray Jum'ah in a church? I said that's in the United States, yes. The second Jum'ah, I took him to the Capitol Hill to have Jum'ah in the U.S. in the Congress, and he surprised that any of the Islamic or the Arab countries allowed you to pray in the parliament there or the People's Council there. I mean that here there's a freedom which I think the U.S. version of the secularism, it's very important for the Arabic countries, because there is a separation between the state and the church. Of course, depends on the constitution and its amendments. At the same time, there is no separation between the policy and the church. I mean, I have been during the election here, and I'm surprised when I see that McCain and Obama, they questioned by the cleric, and they asked them about the abortion and their position on the crest, many religious questions, which very surprised for me, because this is something you cannot imagine in Europe, especially in France. Then you have it here, and any one of them, Obama or McCain, will be the head of the state or the president of the state, then he has to answer all of these questions, which I think that we have to understand that the separation between the state and the church, it's something different but between the separation between the politics and the state. Because now many of Arab regimes, they try to have political parties law to ban any of the political parties to depend on the religious ideas, especially targeting the Islamic political parties, which I think that this is not true in any of the world, because in Europe you have democratic Christian political parties, especially in Germany, Italy, and others. Then why you don't have Islamic democratic political parties? I mean, that depends on Islam as values, as respect for the human rights, the women's rights, or the basic human rights. With the same time, they can engage in the system in very democratic way. I mean the problem with understanding of the French model of the secularism, I think that's hurt the Arabic understanding of the secularism, which banned them to understand other experience of of secularism, especially as I said that in US and Canada. By the chance that if you see the Quebec, which the French provenance in Canada, they have, even that it has more French tradition, but it has much more developed tradition in secularism than France, which I think that because they integrate with the other culture, especially the Anglo-Saxon culture.
Okay. Final question, I guess.
Yeah, just to play with what you're saying, I think.
Oh, could you stand and identify yourself?
Just to play with what you're saying, it's like here in the West there are authoritarian religious traditions, and then there was the tradition, I guess, that developed more in the Protestant vein of small town democracy. And I wonder how that filtered back into the church. Did the church itself become more democratic? The church has become more democratic in certain veins of American life. And how does that work with religious organizations that tend to be more authoritarian? Democracy will affect the religion itself and the way people meet together religiously. Do you think there's an opening throughout the Islamic world, and perhaps in other parts too, to the religions kind of softening to becoming more democratic within their meetings? Because if you don't have a religious meeting that has a democratic quality, it's harder for it to participate in a full sense of democracy. Just wanted to throw that back and maybe you'd comment.
Yeah. Don't forget that the history of the secularism in Western countries is different than the Islamic countries. I mean that in Europe there is struggle between the church, especially the Catholic Church, and the state, which we don't have the same history in the Islamic countries in the 15th or 16th centuries, because actually there is no power for the clerics, or at least, but actually they develop such kind of authority, especially the Grand Mufti in every state. They have not religious authority, but at least they have the authority which has the problem in the Islamic countries. Even that we don't have tradition of struggle between the church and the state, but of course now it's happening inside the Islam itself. As you said exactly, now the question that's how much the political reform or the democratization in the Islamic world will affect our interpretation for Islam, because I believe that the developed countries, they understand, or they interpret, they have developed interpretation for the religion than undeveloped countries. I mean, see that you have different version of Islam. The Islam in the Gulf countries different than the Africa, different than Far East Asia, different than, because Islam itself would coexist with other traditions with different interpretations, which I think believe that the question not beginning of democratize Islam, as many of the US scholars said, how to democratize the Middle East itself. That when you have political reform, when you have political change in Middle East, of course that will reflect on how the people will see the Islam, and this is very important, that the political reform should be the first, not the religion reform, because there is no way to have reform in Al-Azhar without having political reform in Hosni Mubarak Palace. There's no doubt about that, because if still Hosni Mubarak in power, he can use the Grand Mufti, or the Sheikh Al-Azhar in what he wants.
We have to wind up now, or? Okay, that's it? We have time for any more questions?
Just a very tiny.
Okay, well, this gentleman, one tiny. Okay, the microphone is behind you.
Thank you very much. One other word that we haven't used is woman. I believe somebody wrote a book called The Woman Question. I just want to say that Irina Gorbachev was a professor of philosophy, I believe, the wife of Mikhail, and it's just possible that she transmitted something about Kant and the categorical imperative to her husband at some point, if he didn't learn it directly from reading the Russian classics, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment. Thank you.
I've always wondered where that came from, so you may have something there, because I never saw any reference to it.
But even that, it's very difficult to translate Kant into other languages. I have a friend who should translate Kant into Arabic. He spent 16 years in translate one of his books. Then he said that now it will go back, I'll translate it in different way.
Okay, with that, if there, no.
Last question.
Okay.
Like Dr. Ziadeh, you mentioned that Dubai as a country that the Gulf countries is following. What's to prevent Arab countries to follow Turkey? It's an Islamic country, and it has a very real parliament, legal president, and there is a the governor party is Islamic party also.
I think it's, the Turkish model is very important, but don't forget that the Turkish model is developed just recently with the Justice and Development Party. But before that, there is nothing to learn. I mean, there's much more to learn from Turkey at that time. Even that, because it's very important, and I just read an article today which support my argument before, that Turkey follow up the French model of secularism. As I said before, that much of the Arab elites or the Arab intellectuals, they appreciate...
Was the Islamic party following the French version of secularism?
No, I mean that when the Kemal Atatürk came into power in 1924, then he appreciated the French model of secularism, and having very strict, limited way for the religious group, for the political parties and other. Now, of course, may such kind of the background of the secularism in Turkey allowed for the democracy. This is one of the interpretation of the successful of the GDP party, the AK party in Turkey, which we don't have such kind of secularism background in the Middle East. But there is a lot now to learn from Turkey, especially of how the system allowed for the AK party to govern and to be success and to be mediator and to reconcile with other neighbors, especially Turkey with Syria. We have in the edge of the war in 1998. between Turkey and Syria, but now we don't have, there is no visa between the citizens in Syria and Turkey. The same thing how Turkey reconciled with Armenia. I mean, now it's because it's the foreign policy in Turkey during the AK Party. It shift in different way. It became as mediator and to play a very important role in the region. And I think that if there a way for the Arabic elites to learn, I think that this is a question for the future. We'll see that if the other Arabic states will learn to how to interrogate or to allow for the Islamic Party to participate from inside the system.
Okay. Well, that concludes our discussion. I understand we have a gift for Dr. Ziadeh to thank him for his presentation, and I wish you all a happy holiday.